Ukrainian army moved towards Russian territory. The Ukrainian army, which launched an offensive against the city of Kharkov on the border of Ukraine with Russia, managed to push back the Russian forces and the occupied city of Kharkov. Russian soldiers who had to surrender by raising the white flag were very disappointed. The balance of the war between Russia and Ukraine has completely changed after the operation organized by the pro-Ukrainian-Russian Freedom Legion soldiers inside the Russian borders in the past days. For the first time, the Ukrainian army captured towns within Russia's borders, putting a big stamp on the war. While the Kremlin has not yet recovered from the shock of this event, 2 more towns and the city of Kharkov, which were under Russian occupation, were liberated from occupation, thanks to the success of operations organized by the Ukrainian army in the city of Kharkov. Then Ukrainian soldiers blockaded the town where the Russian forces were located. The Russian soldiers in the town had to surrender by waving a white flag from the roof of the building where they were stationed. As it is known, 3 towns of the Russian city of Belgorod have been captured by pro-Ukrainian soldiers. Vladimir Putin, who wants to regain control in the region, started to increase the security measures of the city of Belgorod by withdrawing a large number of Russian soldiers in the city of Kharkov. According to the information obtained from regional sources, more than 4,000 Russian troops have started to be transferred from Kharkov to Belgorod. Following this information provided to the Ukrainian intelligence service, the Ukrainian army took action to organize a major operation against the city of Kharkov. Ukrainian leader Zelensky, who started to accumulate troops in the city of Dnipro, planned to form a large battalion from here and move towards the borders of Kharkov with this battalion. A large battalion consisting of nearly 6,300 soldiers was formed in Dnipro, with Ukrainian troops coming from many regions led by 7 different commanders. The battalion started preparing for an operation to seize the border towns of Kharkiv city. However, the most striking event in the operation was the German-made Leopard 2 tanks used by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army had carried out many successful operations with these tanks and by Germany and the USA. The Ukrainian army, which managed to advance to the town of Merefa in Kharkov, carried out a reconnaissance to identify the area where Russian soldiers were stationed in the town. Ukrainian soldiers who started to control the town with unmanned aerial vehicles detected the buildings where Russian soldiers were hiding. It was determined that the Russian soldiers stationed in a small hospital at the entrance of the town had turned this hospital into a headquarters. The Ukrainian army blocked the entrance to the town to prevent Russian soldiers from leaving the town. Ukrainian soldiers who started firing tank shots with Leopard tanks towards the hospital where Russian forces were located shelled the town. The Ukrainian army, which gave Russian soldiers a hard time with tank shots for minutes, managed to take the Russian soldiers out of the hospital. Ukrainian soldiers waiting in readiness entered the town quickly and continued to clash with Russian soldiers. While the majority of the soldiers in the town got into their armored vehicles and left the area, some of them were still stationed in abandoned buildings and continued clashes. Unable to resist the Ukrainian army's offensive any longer, the majority of Russian soldiers decided to surrender. However, the most interesting event was the Russian soldiers waving a white flag from the roof of the hospital. They had turned into their headquarters. When the Russian soldiers hiding inside the hospital saw that their friends had surrendered, they went up to the roof of the hospital, tied a white bedspread to the barrel of the gun, and started waving it. Seeing a white flag flying from the roof of the hospital, the Ukrainian army quickly entered the courtyard of the hospital and encircled the hospital. Ukrainian soldiers quickly entered the hospital and minutes later came out with 47 Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers arrested by Ukrainian soldiers were kept waiting in the hospital parking lot. According to the information obtained from the Telegram channel, it was stated that the Russian forces in the town withdrew completely and a total of 73 Russian soldiers had to surrender. It was also learned that 45 Russian soldiers were neutralized during the ongoing clashes. Ukrainian troop commander, in a statement on the Telegram channel, stated that the city of Merefa in Kharkiv was completely under the control of the Ukrainian army and did not neglect to share a photo of the Ukrainian flag waving on the Telegram channel. Kharkiv, one of the regions occupied by the Russian army in the first months of the war, is a very important city for Vladimir Putin. This region, which is the border city of Ukraine to Russia, is of great importance for Vladimir Putin. As it is known, the vast majority of weapons and ammunition sent from within Russia's borders are first sent to the city of Kharkov. From Kharkov, this military equipment was distributed to Russian troops in Ukraine. In short, Vladimir Putin was using this region as the coordination center of the Russian army. Vladimir Putin first lost 3 towns in the city of Belgorod, and now he has lost Merefa, one of the most important regions in the city of Kharkov, which he held for months. Thanks to the successful operation of the Ukrainian army, a region in the city of Kharkov, which had been under occupation for months, was liberated from Russian occupation for the first time. According to the information obtained from regional sources, Ukrainian citizens living in the surrounding towns of the liberated region have started to return to the town of Merefa. Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky stated that they have started to deliver food and medicine for the people living in this region. The commanders of the Ukrainian troops organizing the operations stated on social media that they will continue to fight for the full independence and freedom of Ukraine until the end, and that the city of Kharkiv will soon be completely liberated from Russian occupation. One of Putin's biggest fears is that if Kharkov is completely under the control of the Ukrainian army, Russia will cooperate with Ukrainian soldiers stationed in Belgorod. These 3 towns in Russia are still under the control of the Ukrainian army, and if the city of Kharkov is fully captured, the Ukrainian army's border gates to Belgorod will be fully opened. Russian territory would then become a completely open target. Putin, who does not want this to happen, was already started working to increase security measures in Belgorod. Acting on Putin's orders, Russian Army General Valery Gerasimov has already sent 2 Pantsir rare defense systems to Belgorod. At the same time, Russian soldiers who were included in the army with the decision of partial mobilization started to be transferred to Belgorod. As it is known, some of the soldiers included in Putin's partial mobilization were still being kept in readiness. Putin was hesitant to send these soldiers to Ukraine because the Russian army suffered too many casualties in Ukraine because the majority of the soldiers who lost their lives on Ukrainian soil were recruits sent with the mobilization decision. However, since the situation was so critical and Russia's borders were under threat, Putin had no choice but to send these soldiers. Nearly 10,000 Russian soldiers have started to be transferred to the Russian headquarters in Belgorod by Putin's order. At the same time, interestingly, the Russian National Guard soldiers serving within the borders of Russia were also called to duty. For the first time, the National Guard, which is not normally involved in the war, was given a mission and sent to Belgorod territory. As we can understand from this, Putin has a really big true problem and the situation is quite critical. Putin's biggest fear in doing this is that he is afraid of the reaction of the Russian people. Since the beginning of the war, the number of Russian citizens who do not support the occupation in Ukraine has increased considerably. As a result of the airstrikes inside Russia's borders, the people have started to think that Putin is unable to ensure Russia's security, and they are very angry with Putin. Now, the Ukrainian army's entry into Russia's borders by organizing a new operation would greatly shake Putin's authority. For this reason, Putin seems to be playing all the trump cards in his hands. Russia has come under attack within its borders with increasing frequency in recent months, including artillery and drone strikes targeting towns and villages near the Ukrainian border. A cross-border attack has been taking place from Ukraine to Russia's Belgorod region for 15 days, and explosions occur every day at important Russian military facilities in Russia's strategic border cities such as Belgorod, Bryansk and Krasnodar. Mysterious drones attacked the suburbs of Moscow the other day, and the Russian Federation has already reported that 13 UAVs have been intercepted and 3 more homes have been hit. Moscow residents reported less than 7 explosions in the capital. A video posted on social media earlier on Tuesday showed a low-flying drone exploded in a field outside Moscow, with others flying over houses in the city's expensive Rubliovka district or tower apartments in the southwestern neighborhoods. A Russian security guard said, "I was woken up by a loud explosion at 6:15 a.m. and there were about 6 more explosions every 10 minutes for the next 45 minutes. It started happening at 6 a.m. Our house was shaking." Dmitry, who lives in the pine forest-covered Dnipro district just west of Moscow, said that there were 5 to 7 explosions. Russia's defense ministry said 8 drones had targeted the city in one night, but Russian media close to security services wrote that the number was much higher, with more than 30 drones involved in the attack. Drone attacks in Moscow brought the war in Ukraine to the streets of the capital, embarrassing Putin's government for the first time in its 16-month war in Ukraine. Moscow has been targeted by a large-scale drone strike. This marked a new turning point in the conflict, and the Kremlin threatened to take the harshest possible measures in response to the strikes. Neighborhoods where drones have been detected include Krasnogorsk and Dodintsevsky districts along the Rubliovka-Uspenskaya highway in the famous Rubliovka. Russian authorities blamed Ukraine for the drone strikes, which involved 8 drones and caused minor damage to several buildings. Ukraine has welcomed the news, although it denies any role in the attack. The attack, which caused minor damage to 3 apartments, angered Russia's hawks and criticized Vladimir Putin and senior military officials for failing to protect the heart of Kremlin power. 500 kilometers or 310 miles from the front line. So what is the reason for these attacks to have an earthquake effect in the Kremlin? The most notable were the explosions that occurred in the famous Rubliovka, the most elite residence in the Russian Federation in general. Rubliovka is a group of elite residential towns located 10 kilometers west of Moscow. Putin's residences and, most importantly, the elite cottages of Kremlin officials and oligarchs are located along the Rubliov-Uspensky highway in Rubliovka. Why are the attacks on Rubliovka of strategic and psychological importance? At first glance, such attacks do not have a strategic effect because they do not attack military or industrial facilities. But it's quite possible that precisely such strikes will have a much greater effect. First of all, Moscow elites and residents are in great fear as Moscow has been attacked for the 3rd time by a drone swarm. And this is the heaviest of the 3. A swarm of drone strikes targeting Moscow on Tuesday revealed glaring breaches in Moscow's air defense, further alarming and worrying the Russian public. It is so obvious that drones hitting or targeting more than one area will have very serious socio-psychological consequences. There are already reports that thousands of Moscow residents have sold their homes or migrated directly to escape to safer areas along the Rubliovka-Uspensky highway. With Putin's official residences Barvika and Novo-Ogaryovo, there are also elite hostels for officials, elites, and summer towns known since Soviet times. In particular, the price of a cottage in this area starts at several $million. The average price easily reaches $5 to $10 million, and the figures more than $30 to $40 million is quite common. The maximum possible concentration of homes of Russian oligarchs, high-ranking officials, and all other similar people is in the Rubliovka as close as possible to the Kremlin. And at least at this time, drones are being shot over their heads. It is interesting that the Russian Federation will not even be able to turn it in favor of a strike against local residents because it will be necessary to show palaces and castles on television. And in the end, ordinary citizens of the Russian Federation are more likely to find support for such strikes than a sense of unity with representatives of the Kremlin elite, because the Kremlin, oligarchs, and officials now see with their own eyes their personal vulnerability and the inability of the Putin regime to guarantee security. These people generally do not care about the losses of the Russian army because it does not affect them in any way. However, the threat of losing one's own life and property will directly affect them. Moreover, it serves as evidence of the regime's weakness, which is now critical to Putin. It is precisely because the Russian leader created the simplest system of vertical power, the basis of which is the undisputed priority of the power of the Kremlin. Moreover, more residents of Rubliovka now have an extremely simple question. If drones fly to Moscow, what will happen when cruise missiles fly? In fact, with this attack, it is the first time that the war has come home for most Muscovites. So the psychological impact of these drones, which were shot down or at least harmlessly shot down at the epicenter of the affluent Moscow suburb on Russia's elite, is truly dramatic. Maybe in retrospect, this is some kind of turning point in the war. In a way, this undermines Putin's war effort as it shows that the capital is vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. The drone strike on Moscow also highlighted the capital's vulnerability as more Russian territory came under fire amid prospects for a Ukrainian counterattack. When people are scared, they look for a safe place and their homes no longer seem safe. The war has entered a different phase, as the Ukrainians have so far shown their potential to launch relatively large-scale attacks, albeit symbolic. Ukrainians want exactly that, to do exactly that. This is a debate, but the short answer is pretty straightforward. They want to raise their own morale and they want to demoralize Russia. And in that sense, this brings the war home and undoubtedly shows fear and hatred in Russian society. But above all, this attack undoubtedly shows the fear in the Russian elite and undermines one of Putin's narratives that the war is a little far off, which in turn undermines Moscow's smugness. Until now, residents of Moscow despised the war and everyone was kind of ignoring it. But now, starting today, it becomes quite impossible for them to ignore. So what was the reaction of Moscow residents and Kremlin officials after the attacks? Pro-Russian bloggers harshly criticized government officials, and Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group, accused Russia's military leaders of failing to defend the country against drones. I was woken up by a loud explosion at 6:15 a.m. and there were about 6 more explosions every 10 minutes. For the next 45 minutes, a Russian security guard said. It was a terrible situation. Everybody went out to their balcony or went out. Nobody understood what was going on, the security guard said. Some people were shocked, but nothing can surprise me anymore. The security guard said, I mean, Ukraine has already hit the Kremlin before he was in the elite security community in Zhukovka, near where the strikes took place. It started happening at 6 a.m. Our house was shaking. Dmitry, who lives in the pine forest, had covered Dnipro district just west of Moscow, said that there were 5 to 7 explosions. Alexander Kinstein, a prominent member of the Russian parliament, wrote on his Telegram channel that UAVs were shot down in 5 different areas in the Moscow region. The elite, including the Novo-Ogaryovo state residence of Vladimir Putin, numerous prominent officials and politicians reproached the defense ministry for allowing drones to enter Moscow's airspace. Among them were prominent war hawks who called for more aggressive attacks and wider mobilization for the war in Ukraine. Others noted that previous attacks had higher hit value targets, including a drone strike that targeted the Kremlin earlier this month. As a result, the explosions that took place in many regions of Moscow, the capital of Russia, caused a great psychological collapse among the Moscow people and elites. Although the Kremlin denies it, as we have just mentioned, perhaps this is the purpose of the Ukrainians, because in Kiev, people live in tunnels, subways and shelters every minute of every day. For them, it's a daily occurrence to see a Russian missile or a UAV explode at any moment. Aren't they afraid? Of course they are afraid, however, for the sake of their freedom. Unlike the Russians, they do not leave their homeland and fight for full independence. We hope that this aimless war will end as soon as possible, with Ukraine gaining full freedom and territorial integrity. There are a lot of updates from the Luhansk region here before the new year. the Ukrainians launched an offensive operation despite the fact that forest battles are slower. The Ukrainians still brought massive results. They advanced by more than 2 kilometers. They pushed the Russians from their last defense line, and now both parties are preparing for the final battle in Kremenna. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians assaulted Russian positions north of Dnipro in the first stage of the operation. The Ukrainians managed to reduce Russian control around Dnipro significantly, but when the fighting got close to the main base, moving forward became much more difficult as the Russians here had more established positions and better supplies. Besides, the only area under Russian control basically remained the forest, so the Ukrainians could not generate rapid breakthroughs here with their mobile units. That is why the fights became positional, engaging only infantry, artillery and aviation. The deteriorating weather conditions also played a role. The Ukrainians here waited for the drop in temperature to conduct this offensive operation, but it seems like several days in, the temperature rebounded and there was rain followed by several days of above zero temperature. Luckily, the Ukrainian offensive did not suffer as much as it could. The reason why the Ukrainian offensive did not fail is that they managed to push the Russians from the fields. So the Ukrainians used the fields while they could gain some ground and secured their positions along the forest. And after that, the forest battle started where the Ukrainians could not use their cars anyway, regardless of whether it was raining or not. Still, as you can imagine, even in the forest, dry weather is preferable for the offensive operation. That is why the offensive operation has inadvertently slowed down but not stopped. During this humid conditions, both the Ukrainians and the Russians started to rely on artillery and aviation more heavily. According to a Russian source, the Ukrainians have around 1,500 servicemen constantly storming Russian positions. According to Military Land, the Ukrainians have deployed the 45th Artillery Brigade to the spot of operation, which is to a large extent focused on the area of the main action Kremenna. Additionally, to provide air support to ground troops, the Ukrainians continue to engage in tactical aircraft Su-27 and MiG-29 from the airfield in northern Ukraine. The Russians seem to have slowly given in to the pressure. Ukrainian Deputy Chief of the Main Operational Directorate reported that Ukrainian forces have advanced 2.5 kilometers in the direction of Kremenna over the past week and are continuing offensive actions towards the settlement. Later, a social media post claimed that Ukrainian forces captured Dnipro. There was no official confirmation of the Ukrainians entering this village, so the post was disregarded. However, when several days later Russian Ministry of Defense reported about hunting down Ukrainian artillery around Dnipro, it became obvious that the Russians had left it. This doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have entered it. It looks like it is a gray zone that no party can occupy due to the overwhelming fire. Additionally, a reserve officer and military analyst indirectly confirmed that the Russians left Dnipro by saying that the Ukrainians are operating less than 5 kilometers away from Kremenna. Other Russian sources are largely indicating that the battle for Kremenna has almost started. A Bar 13 affiliated source claimed that Ukrainian forces are preparing to attack Kremenna from 3 directions. Another Russian source said that they are expecting a Ukrainian counter-offensive operation once the ground freezes in the area, which is forecasted to drop below zero in 2 days and stay below zero for more than a month. Some sources also emphasize that the Ukrainians are even preparing the infrastructure to supply and support the stormtroopers by erecting additional pontoon crossings southwest of Kremenna. The Russians are trained to adapt to the rapidly worsening situation. The Ukrainian head of the Luhansk region reported that Russian forces are continuing to transfer more equipment and personnel to the Kremenna area, including a substantial number of Wagner Group personnel. However, it seems like they understood that this would not be enough and have reinforced Kremenna with their elite airborne forces. Additionally, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian forces relocated here and already started using thermobaric artillery systems, which is a high-value military district-level asset. The fact that the Russians are allocating here the best of what they have means that they are very concerned with losing Kreminna. And this is not surprising because they had spent a considerable number of resources in order to erect a formidable defense line around Svardov. But if the Ukrainians take Kreminna, then they can simply go around it. Kreminna is an incredibly valuable town by establishing control over it. The Ukrainians could attack Svardov, Starobilsk, and Lysychansk. But the most important thing is that the Russian logistics will be completely immobilized. Their rear positions will be compromised and the front line can crumble even until the pre-war line of separation.